Hi, everybody. My name is Andy Kim, and I am a resource specialist with InterVarsity's Multi-Ethnic Ministries Department. And this week we are gathered in Orlando, Florida, where about 300 InterVarsity staff have been exploring the topic of reconciliation and mission. And as we're gathering in Florida, we also have about 100 staff who are gathering around the country in our virtual experience program. And engaging from their own specific context. And so we wanted to make some webinars and content available for all you out there who are watching virtually, and for other folks who may have found us on social media or through our blog, Multi-Ethnic Matters. So we hope that whether you're watching this live or whether you're catching this at a later date, that the next 60 minutes we spend together will be a time where God would lead us deeper in what does it mean as His people to lead others into biblical reconciliation. So we are excited at what might happen today, and so yeah, hope as you continue to join us, we can have a great conversation. So I'd like to welcome Joe Ho, who is our National Director of Asian American Ministries, and he will be our keynote speaker for today. Yeah, Joe, would you want to just introduce yourself to us?
Sure. Well, I'm Joe. I'm originally from Ohio. My parents were immigrants, Chinese immigrants, and I grew up in an immigrant church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and went to college in North Carolina. Have been on staff with InterVarsity in one capacity or another since 93, 94, and it's my privilege to work with the Asian American Ministries Department for our staff and students. We live in Austin, Texas. We recently moved there with our family, my wife of 19 years, and her having a multiracial marriage, multiracial children, and also my wife's experience as an educator has also been a deeply formative part of our reconciliation journey and understanding culture, cross ethnicity, and reconciliation.
Great. Well, so for those of you who are watching online, we will be taking questions via Twitter. So if you have a question that you want to ask Joe anytime throughout this presentation, feel free to tweet using the hashtag MESC15 webinar. And we will try to get to those questions at the end of our time. Joe, why don't we just start? Let me ask you, why is it important to start with theology? And why do you feel that's relevant for those of us who are hoping to move students forward in reconciliation? Why theology? Uh-oh. It looks like Joe may be stalled.
You don't have to start with theology, I suppose. As a matter of fact, most people don't. But I think what I hope we can talk about today is that if we understand theology from a theological perspective, it will not only give us a by reconciliation, but because students come from different theological influences, students that are from churches, they will have different kinds of on-ramps, different parts of the reconciliation message are easier on-ramps for them, and other ones are harder. And what I'm hoping we'll do today is to be able to identify what some of those are, and as you are encountering students and faculty from various backgrounds, you'll be able to maybe see patterns of open doors and closed doors, resistance and response, and maybe it'll be a helpful way for you to engage.
Okay. Well, and maybe let's just start really broadly. When you say reconciliation, what are you describing? Can you just give us an overview of what do you mean when you say reconciliation?
Sure. So my wife Tracy does the books for our finances, and so when and most months everything lines up perfectly, right? And but then every once in a while, there's a month where you added up the things that you thought you spent and deposited, and then our records on the computer, and it doesn't match up. And then she goes on the search, right? A search for figuring out, this doesn't match up, and it needs to match up. I need to figure out where the things went wrong, and then get it so that it matches up what we thought wasn't actually what it actually was. And sometimes they're like, $100, like things that are off where you're like, oh, that's a decent amount. And then sometimes it's like a 20-cent thing that's off. And for Tracy at least, like a 20-cent thing, she's going to find it. Like I am going to find the 20 cents that's off between what I thought it was and what it actually is, and it's going to fit again. What it was off, and now it's fit again. Reconciliation is the understanding that one way to understand the whole purposes of God with regard to creation and all things is that all the things that are off, He wants to put them back again. That's reconciliation. And the things that are off with people and God, the things that are off with people and each other, the things that are off with people and creation, and even in a sense the things that are off with people in our relationships with ourselves, like God is on this search to find every big or little thing that's off and to set it right again. So that's reconciliation in the biggest sense.
Yeah. Well, could you talk maybe a little bit about some of the different components, the ways that you're understanding the dynamics or the different axes of reconciliation?
Sure. Well, there a couple of ways that have been helpful for me is to see that reconciliation happens, that we were just talking about, it happens on an individual level, and it also happens on a corporate level. So, like individual people, we need reconciliation to God, to individual other people, to creation. So there are broken things that are not right individually, that's as individual people. But also reconciliation is corporate. Groups of people also have things that are off with our group relationship with God, with our group relationship with other groups, with our group relationship with the world and around it. So the reconciliation occurs individually and corporately. The other thing that we see in the Bible, and this is maybe where it gets a little more theological, is that reconciliation is both already and not yet. So reconciliation is something that particularly in Paul, you see him saying that reconciliation is something that God has done already, but it's still something that's not yet accomplished. And so you can see already this is a reconciliation, but you see this in Paul all the time where he says something's already true even if it's not true. Like, for example, Paul will call people saints, which means holy one. He'll say, you're holy, and then the very next sentence, it seems, he would say, and by the way, stop sleeping with your mother-in-law, that's not cool, right? And so that's a sense when something is already and not in the Bible also presents reconciliation as something that is already done, accomplished by Jesus, and it's also something that's not yet. We are not yet fully reconciled. So using these two axes, I found that that's one helpful way to think about students as their starting point. And so if we look at these two different axes, I'd like to introduce you to maybe 4 representative people you can encounter, and I will use students because a lot of my experience is with students, although I've seen non-students who fit in these categories as well. So I found every once in a while, you encounter a student, I'll say a student, who comes from the holiness background. And you'll recognize a student. There are some churches out there that call themselves holiness churches, but there's also a lot of other churches, for instance, ones that call themselves Wesleyan, or other churches like that that are very related to the holiness movement. And so and also a lot of fundamentalist churches draw a lot from this kind of tradition. You'll recognize a student like this if they come in and they have a high sense of separation from worldly things, sort of meticulous about morality, and a high concern for not being like the world and living differently. They'll tend to be pretty conservative with regard to what they will do and what they won't do. And I've encountered a lot of students like that. A lot of immigrant churches have a strong influence from here. A second place would be the Reformed tradition. So the Reformed tradition, you'll encounter students. I encounter students sometimes that will call themselves Reformed or Presbyterian. They'll like authors like John Piper, Tim Keller as older authors, and then younger authors like David Platt. Used to be Mark Driscoll. He's not, is sort of out of vogue as much these days. But and also these will tend to be students. They'll be ones that like read books about theology and think about theology. That's a Reformed tradition. A third tradition would be the liturgical tradition. we would call these sort of high church traditions like Catholic, Orthodox, Episcopalian churches, ones that value connection with history, connection with liturgy. And then the third would be the social justice tradition, so students who come from churches that really emphasize activism, social justice, the writing of justice. And so a lot of the civil rights movement comes out of the social justice tradition. And what we see on this grid is that each of these four starting points has an affinity for one of these axes. For instance, the old holiness tradition has an affinity for the not yet and the individual. So the individual is not yet completely reconciled. The Reformed tradition has these students will have a tendency to resonate with the individual and already, what God's already done for you. The liturgical tradition has a resonance with the corporate and already, like what's true about the church, what's true about the community of God, and the social justice tradition or starting point. These students will have a resonance with sort of the corporate not yet, the problems with groups and with injustices in the world, oppression and racism. And so this is one way to map where people come from. And what you'll see is that people that come from these traditions, because they have this bent, there are different approaches to reconciliation that they'll most resonate with. Now, I just wanted to make an observation too that not all, you can't pigeonhole any given person into just one of these boxes. Most people have multiple influences. Most churches will have multiple influences here. As a matter of fact, strong theological traditions almost always have multiple multiple streams of influence. You rarely find one that has all of them, but like the strong ones usually will have more than one. If you have just one of these, they'll actually tend to be somewhat off. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things that as you're sharing that resonates with me is I think about my background growing up in a Korean American church. I could really see how particularly the Reformed and the holiness quadrants were particularly resonant, and we did have this belief in kind of the individual already, that you have been saved once for all in Christ, embrace the gospel, but there was this deep, sometimes angsty need for pursuing holiness and individual holiness. So I think it's fascinating to consider how maybe these quadrants, how churches may kind of lay in multiple quadrants or in different gradients. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think my background was more in the holiness tradition. I would say probably closer to a fundamentalist kind of a, if you want to use that terminology. Where there was a high emphasis on, trusting Jesus, yes, but a lot on, obedience to Jesus, living for Him, sharing your faith, the not yet, the improvements that you need to make in your life. So I think that was my kind of background. And then I've encountered, people from many of these others as well. Also, a word about Pentecostals. Like, if we had 3D, we might be able to put another quadrant in on this, but I would say most Pentecostals will sort of map pretty closely onto the holiness quadrant of this particular model.
Yeah, and I think as we go deeper into this grid and unpack some of the things, I think more specific cases or context will emerge. But I want to actually move to, so now that we've kind of outlined the different starting points theologically for folks, how do you begin, or what are some of the traditional ways that we make appeals or make invitations to reconciliation from these starting points?
Right. And so once you are able to identify where somebody's starting point is, then you can decide, you can end up making an appeal that will most easily resonate with them. For instance, if someone comes from a holiness tradition, a strong appeal for reconciliation can be made from simple commands to love. 1 Corinthians 12, there's one body and every part's important. James 2, if you love God and hate your neighbor, it makes you a liar. So I think that the straightforward commands and what we're supposed to do, we find those. That's something that really works in terms of an appeal to someone starting from the holiness tradition. Now, let's say we take the Reformed tradition, because the Reformed tradition has a strong emphasis on theology and a sense of what the gospel is. In the Reformed tradition, you would find resonance if you make an appeal to the nature of the gospel. So Ephesians 2 is a passage that talks about what Jesus has done for us, and there's a lot of Protestantism, especially Reformed theology, that looks at the first half of Ephesians 2 that talks about Jesus has already saved us and he's reconciled us to God. But the second half of Ephesians 2 talks just the same way about how the cross of Jesus has reconciled us to each other, that it's broken a dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile, and that's the nature of the gospel. When it comes from a liturgical tradition, more high church tradition, will resonate with an appeal to the nature of the church. So, for instance, to say the church is one, the church is Catholic, which means universal. So it's one church. We are all part of one church, and therefore reconciliation. That's the mandate for reconciliation, is that part of one church, God has already put us in one church. Or Catholicity, which is a word of saying worldwide, that there are no divisions, that the church is one church worldwide. There are also ways that, in a more sophisticated way, you can make an appeal to the sacraments. The sacraments are important in the liturgical traditions, to say that how can Christians, be baptized into the same name of Jesus and still be separated, or to say that we've all take communion at the same table, but we can't eat at the same table. So those kinds of appeals to the sacraments. And finally, the social justice tradition is one that where people are resonant with the need in the world. In some ways, the social justice tradition is the shortest routes to what we think about racial reconciliation, is because there's a strong resonance with the not yet and the corporate. If you show stories of unreconciliation, stories of injustice, or broader sociological insights that show the injustice of the world, that's an appeal that will resonate with the social justice tradition. The thing I want to point out too is that in the university world, we often think of reconciliation and racial reconciliation as trying to get people here to this quadrant, where we understand the not yet in the corporate. And the point I want to make is that actually all four of these quadrants are important, and that we have to get around to all of them. And just the not yet corporate aspect of reconciliation is actually not enough. It's that we actually need to get all four quadrants eventually. But what we're talking about is starting points.
Yeah, and so I think now that we've gone a little deeper, let's take it a step further now. So you've given us the grid, you've given us the appeal. So what do we, as staff and as ministry leaders who maybe are starting to intuitively recognize some of these theological starting points, we're starting to see the nuances and complexities in our communities. And maybe the categories, for me at least, have been really helpful in trying to name some of the places where I found myself and others. So what do we do with this as people who want to lead in reconciliation?
Sure. So once we know where we can initially appeal, I think it's important for us to move beyond that and not just make one kind of appeal, but try to disciple students into a full orb understanding of reconciliation. And so one of the things why this grid I think is helpful is that if you look at, if you're trying to teach reconciliation, it's actually very hard to teach reconciliation diagonally on this. By that I mean, if you're trying to teach somebody who comes from one of these starting points the thing that is diagonal from it on the grid, it's much more difficult. You'll find that if you try to make an appeal along one of these diagonal lines, people are going to have a hard time connecting with it. They'll look at you and it'll seem like more of a foreign language. It's more difficult because you don't share one of the axes, right? You share neither the same axis on individual, corporate, or already not yet. But if you want to stretch people a little bit, it is less difficult if you try to communicate to people based on what is an adjacent square rather than a diagonal square. Because you share either the individual corporate perspective or the already or not yet perspective, it's easier to, as you expand people's view of reconciliation, to expand it along these adjacent lines. So let me give you an example. Let's take, for example, the Reformed tradition. So I got a graduate degree from a Reformed theological institution. I appreciate a lot of that tradition. And I've had a number of students and have gone to churches that have a strong sense of this tradition. So let's take the Reformed tradition. And you'll see that in the Reformed tradition, there's a strong emphasis in the gospel and a resonance. So if you want to resonate with the Reformed tradition, you want to appeal to the nature of the gospel and say, this actually is what in the gospel. It actually is the gospel. One of the great things about Ephesians 2 is it says that the cross, it says he's reconciled them both to God through the cross by which he's put to death their hostility. That's part of Ephesians 2. So what it's, and one of the things that in the Reformed tradition where it's really important to say this is the gospel. And one of the things that Ephesians 2 allows you to say is, Ephesians 2 says that breaking down walls of hostility between people was accomplished by the cross. And there's no closer definition to the gospel than that which was accomplished by the cross, in Jesus by the cross. And so I think that you can make that appeal in the Reformed tradition to say that is the gospel. That's included in the gospel. It's integral to the gospel. Now, it would be harder to go immediately from there to go diagonally on this grid to say, and then here are incarceration statistics, and we need to respond as Christians by going to this rally. It would feel a little bit jarring, and it would still feel like maybe a foreign language. But if you make an appeal to either of the adjacent squares, that would be less difficult. If you said, based on the gospel, we also see, it's integral to the gospel, and there are commands for us to love people, and therefore we need to respond to them. Or if there was the nature of the church, to say it's integral to the gospel, and also, the nature of the church is that we're one church, or the nature of the church is universal throughout the world. It's takes precedence over divisions, human divisions, and so I think that's those adjacent blocks will be the less difficult route. So I think that shows up on the next slide. So you can appeal to commands to love or the church. And then even if you want to get eventually to the social justice quadrant, which is important for us to get all the way around, it's easier to get there via the holiness route. So one way you could do this is because in Reformed theology, your individual reconciliation happens, but you also still need sanctification, right? So you could say, just as our already accomplished salvation and reconciliation with God doesn't mean that our sanctification is complete, so that what God has already accomplished in the gospel in terms of reconciliation with groups doesn't mean that we don't have to work at the gaps, work at the not yet in terms of social justice. Or you can go the other route via church to say what Jesus has already done in the gospel is to reconcile us to Him, that there is a heavenly reality that we are already one, and just as we live out that heavenly reality in our individual lives, we need to live out that heavenly reality of being one in our social in terms of social justice, in terms of being one. And so this is an example of how you would use the quadrants, use this tool to make appeals, and then also to disciple students into a whole-orbed understanding of the gospel, of reconciliation.
Yeah, Joe, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, well, for me, I think working primarily with Asian American and Black students, I think I found these categories to be particularly resonant, mainly because of some of the failures that I've had of trying to get Asian Americans who are really steeped in the Reformed tradition to social justice. It feels like I am kind of talking past them when I try to, talking about the new Jim Crow or trying to bring up systemic injustice, and it just feels like we're on different wavelengths, or it kind of is as a buzzer of like liberal, and it just turns people off. There's no connection. And so I think over the years, I intuitively would kind of go to the, oh yeah, the gospel is true. What about the second half of Ephesians? And then how does that lead us to think systemically? But I think seeing this grid, it's like, oh, I wish I had this grid like 7 years ago. It would have saved a ton of time. For you then, Joe, how did you? Yeah, go ahead.
No, no. I was saying, what I was thinking is that I would tend to have a lot of Chinese American students that were in the holiness tradition, and probably had a lot of influence from that. And I wanted to get them to the social justice box, but I sort of went the long way around. I sort of said, well, you need to first learn what God's already done for you, individually, and then what God's already done in terms of our of the gospel and what He's done in terms of one new humanity and the church, and then to understand the social justice quadrant. And as I reflect on doing that, it made me realize that if I actually used this tool when I was a campus staff, I was going the long way around. Like I might have been able to make a more direct appeal from the holiness tradition into the social justice tradition, instead of sort of discipling all the way around. And the other thing I've noticed too is that you'll in people that come from the social justice tradition, someone for me that has had a lot of influence from the Reformed tradition is that trying to jump directly there is also one that often ends up not being helpful, because it tends to sound like it's disregarding the disregarding the not yet, disregarding the sometimes at the expense of the corporate. So I think that's another thing that I've noticed.
Yeah, and I think this grid also helps me to think about how working within black ministry, black campus ministry context, I think I really saw in my students and in some of the black churches that we were a part of the seamless way that social justice and holiness was lived out, and it wasn't really, for me, embracing justice and systemic issues was this huge leap that I had to make. But what I saw in some of the churches that we worked with it was just kind of all one thing, from your really deep personal piety and fasting and worship and prayer, but also just a seamless transition into caring for the poor and policy and politics. And so in some ways this grid helps us say, okay, where are flat sides in my own understanding of reconciliation, and how might different cultural expressions be able to offer those to the wider body?
And there are highly mature churches, so that's why I talk about theological starting points. I don't want to call it churches, because you see highly mature churches that do actually teach this all the way around. And they may on the surface identify more with one or the other, but when you see the highly mature churches and theological traditions, you'll see that they have a starting point in their tradition, but they do encompass the rest of those. So that's why I think I prefer for this to be thought as a tool for people's starting points, depending on their what their strength might be or deficiencies might be. But it is important to realize too. I also think within InterVarsity we have a high value for when we're talking about reconciliation. We often think about the social justice quadrant, and whereas I think that is an important thing to bring, it's also important to know that no matter where people come from, they need to get all the way around the 4 boxes.
Yeah, and so we got some good questions coming in from Twitter. The first one is from Peg Pie. I don't know who you are. I know you're on staff, but Peg Pie asks, Joe, do you think there is a difference between the phrase social justice and biblical justice?
I think that that distinction is something that we can use in order to distinguish distinguish like activism that is disconnected from God and say biblical justice. I would say that there's a secular vision of justice, regardless of calling it social justice. There's secular justice and there's biblical justice. Social justice just means justice amongst relationships, right? Social justice. And so I would say biblical justice. You can make that distinction. I'm not sure. I think I know some ministries who make a distinction there. I know a ministry that says we're not about social justice, we're about gospel justice. I think that's fine, and it's a reformed, it's a heavily reformed influenced ministry, and so I think it's fine to make that distinction in order to say that you're not like secular activism, and I'm fine with that. I'm also fine with the term social justice. To use a reformed writer, Tim Keller has a book that goes into the primary Hebrew words for righteousness and justice and what they actually mean and the way that they're used together. And Tim Keller, a reformed thinker, says, and in English, the best transliteration, or the best representation of these two concepts is the term social justice. So I think that I'm fine with that. But yeah, we do need. I do think the point is taken that we need to make a distinction between God's approach to justice and secular versions. But like, you'd be surprised, when we talk about some very there are some secular thinkers about justice that have very, very good and full-orbed views of what it means for people to get social justice, people to get along, and what that means. And it's not just let's all get along, and it's not just pure activism, and there's some good vision for that. Some of it's because they had the Christian influence of the civil rights movement on the secular activist circles. Like there's some of that influence there. So like I said, it's helpful to teach your students that there's a difference between what the university says and what you're doing. But I also don't want to make the enemy, like, I don't want to say what the university is doing, like they're bad, we're good. I think that, they don't have all four boxes, that's for sure. So.
That's a good way to put it. And I think the question of biblical justice versus social justice also goes into really the divide between individual and corporate understandings of the gospel. And and we talked about this earlier, Joe, that I almost feel like there needs to be a third column to the right of corporate that's systemic, where you have individual, you have corporate people, and then you have systems and structures that would kind of mess up the whole neatness and elegance of 2x2. But that whole spectrum there, it seems to be different political camps and struggles around, from individual, or us and God, individual, us and other people, and then people and structures, and how reconciliation is involved in all those aspects.
Right. And there are theological camps that, particularly the liberation theology camp, that does a really good job of thinking along all those kinds of lines. And again, the mature versions of liberation theology will also include the other quadrants, and then you also have ones that's all it is and doesn't include any of the other ones.
Yeah, here's another question from Twitter. This is from Josh Dang, and he asks, can someone tell me why we are all aiming for social justice as finality?
Aiming for social justice as finality. Wish I knew more of what he meant. I think it is true that just as an individual holiness, that we aim for it. We aim for it not because we think they're going to get there and we don't have to try some more, but because we believe that it's possible. That working for it matters, and also that it's possible. It's possible in the next moment. I don't know who. I think it was my staff worker Steve Hinkle once, who was talking about Wesley's view of perfection. And a lot of times we think the view of perfection is that, Wesleyans think that you can become a perfect person. And at least he told me. Again, I don't know where he came from, but he told me, he said, when you asked Wesley, he said, I believe that it's possible for you to be perfect in this next moment. Right? So not necessarily as a finality, but to say that, when do you think perfect holiness is possible? It's like, well, perfect holiness it's temporarily possible right now. Like, you can actually choose to be holy this 1 second, And beyond that, to say that finality, I'm not sure if that's like, I would say that scripturally, the finality is when Jesus comes and sets all things right. But I think that it's important to say that the mandate for us to try to be absolutely, completely just in the next moment, that ambition is important. I heard a talk once about unity in the body of Christ once, that says, every athlete shoots for perfection when they're playing. Every one of them knows that they're not going to make it, but that doesn't stop them, from every single one of them, from trying the next time to actually achieve it. And I thought, oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, and Josh, if we didn't answer your question, you could maybe send us a clarification tweet and we can come back to it. Another question, this comes from James Alderson, and he asks, Joe, getting from the top left to the bottom right is helpful. Can you give us another example, like bottom right to top left or other ways?
Yeah, bottom right to top left. You know, I would say that, let me think a little bit. Trying to think of more examples. Yeah, so I mean, I would say, for instance, if someone comes from a social justice tradition, and you sense that, I would say that, for instance, if we have a social justice tradition, you might have somebody who really cares a lot about justice. So this is actually not even a theological position, but if you have a person who is, say, an activist on campus that may not even be a believer, let's just say they're not a believer. I think, and I wish I'd done this because I'm thinking about a student that I knew that really got the social justice thing. And I wish what I'd done is to have some more conversations about the nature of the church. Now I know that where that doesn't scratch the issues is that, you know, they believe that reconciliation is possible amongst all human beings, and I think that you still have to reconcile that. But I wish I'd had more conversations about, well, in terms of the Christian view of the church and how that's a view of social justice. It's actually, for Christians, social justice is something that is achieved in society and achieved in society by means of demonstrating it in the church. Now, some people may disagree with me with that, but like I would say, the Christian perspective is our view is to advocate and call out for social justice, but the other thing is for us to actually demonstrate it in terms of us being one church, and the doctrine of how the doctrine of being one church is the one that would most is our best route toward achieving social justice. For instance, one of the I've heard some pacifists say, you know, there's a somewhat, you know, snarky but helpful poster from a pacifist. You know, whether or not you're a pacifist or not, the appeal goes like this: let all the Christians of the world agree that we will not kill each other. Now, what they're not saying is that it's okay for Christians to kill non-Christians. What they are saying is that if Christians first of all agree that, as a rule, I as a Christian will not kill another Christian, that's going to upset the entire apple cart of war. You know, because, you know, what would you do? What would you do if you're sent to war in almost any other country? You're at risk of, you know, of killing another Christian on a battlefield. And so I think that is like, whether or not you subscribe to be a pacifist or not, that's a line of reasoning, you know, that you can use to sort of show secular activists that there's a theological way of approaching, you know, social justice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think the example that came to my mind, particularly doing spring break urban programs, where we have, you know, where I've had very committed activists who've come along that are either nominal believers or unbelievers, that they get the social justice message of reconciliation, and that the corporate not yet reality is just, it is the assumption. It's whether from their lived experience or just their passion. And so when they hear that side of the gospel, it's just bam. And in some ways, the challenge for me has been, how do I learn to speak that for the purpose of witness and to try to articulate and make the gospel good news? But then what I found is, when we spend the week together or the summer together, and then we start talking about spiritual disciplines and Sabbath, there is this incredible, it's this the weight that's lifted off. And I can't tell you how many times where I've done an urban program, and where I staffed an urban program 2 years ago, and I remember I had more conversations about body image and just personal struggles, and I felt this kind of weird feeling of, here we are doing this urban program, and yet I'm talking to these gifted activist students about these deeply personal issues, and it felt a little bit off-putting to me. Like, we should be talking about the systems, and but I think seeing this grid is saying, oh, the gospel is moving them through that quadrant, and really, in some ways, it's into that place of holiness and that individual not yet. And then it's the real good news of the already individual power of the Reformed tradition, which is my tradition, to say, yes, that you try to do the Sabbath, you try to have spiritual disciplines, but there's still that deep kind of angstiness, brokenness, and really in Christ there is you have grace. And so I feel like that journey, I've seen that journey happen in students.
That's great, Andy.
Yeah, well, and actually, Josh actually gave a good clarification question, and I think this is helpful. He asked, are we trying to get to the bottom of the right quadrant, or are we trying to grasp all four quadrants? So how do we hold this together, or is there a particular reason why we've highlighted the bottom right quadrant? So how would you explain that?
I think in the example that I gave, that was the bottom right quadrant was the destination because we started in the top left, and so since we started in the top left, we were talking about how do you get all the way around, and I was just making so we could have so it's similar to the second question. Like if we started in the top right, then we could say, well, we've got to get all the way around, and the point is. Not that the bottom left is a destination, but that if let's say you start in top right, let's say you start with liturgical tradition. If you start with the liturgical tradition, if you want people to have all four, a full understanding of reconciliation, it will work less well to jump immediately to the holiness tradition and appeals to commands about to love and commands that you're supposed to follow. And it would be easier to be able to make appeals across to the nature of the gospel, or appeals to the need in the world, and then end up in the holiness quadrant. So does that make sense, Josh? Is like that's where that the destination is just however you get all the way around. Like for instance, you could go randomly around this too. We're just talking about trying to see where the resistance is.
Yeah. And I think another side. I think the way that you just described that move from the liturgical to the holiness, I feel like when I've seen my colleagues from Catholic, Anglican, Episcopalian traditions who that I really respect, it's because I see the liturgical tradition that's really robust, but I see the Reformed piece that they actually like. They love Tim Keller, but they're still deeply Catholic. They are deeply the holiness tradition is rich, and I think for all the quadrants there seems to be maybe there's caricatures or stereotypes of what it might look like to be underdeveloped. So stereotypical Reformed or stereotypical liturgical or stereotypical social justice or stereotypical holiness. So I don't know. Like maybe could you give us a sense, Joe, of like how for many of us, we're on staff or we're ministry leaders. What are the kind of skills? You've kind of given us the theological framework in this really helpful 2x2 grid. I mean, somebody has said how the speaking their language. I think Ralph is really feeling your 2x2 structure here. But what are the skills that we would need to actually now put this into practice, or what are the action steps for those of us in ministry we need to do to actually work with this grid?
Well, I think some of it is just the understanding that in our own thinking of reconciliation, I think when we in InterVarsity say reconciliation, we typically mean racial reconciliation, bottom right quadrant, And I think in some ways, maybe to Josh's point, like that's an important quadrant. But when we say reconciliation by itself, it's not always a shorthand, or shouldn't always be a shorthand for racial reconciliation. But that racial reconciliation is part of God's overall plan for all creation. So I think that's a skill, is to be able to use the word reconciliation well, to be able to use it in terms of all the ways that the world is off and all the ways that God wants to restore it. So I'm not sure if that's a skill. Maybe it's a teaching skill of being able to understand. If you use the big story app or diagram, that actually talks. If you look at the big story, it mainly depicts the brokenness of people in the world, right? That's the easiest version of the New World diagram. We can put a link up for that for people who may not be familiar with that, the four worlds or the New World diagram. And so for us to be able to have some skill in using like presentations like that, I think that's helpful. I think the other skill is just being able to listen to students and ask them what their background is, and honestly to have some basic understanding of theological traditions. Like a book that I think is helpful for this is Streams of Living Water. It's a book by I think it's a Richard Foster book. And so this is like these four I think come from are 3 or 4 of his 5 or 6 of them, and it's just instead of talking about different theological camps, it actually talks about 5 or 6 different ways people connect to God, and I think they're like I can't remember what they all are. Kind of contemplative, holiness, evangelical, social justice, and charismatic, and I think incarnational might be another one. So I think that being familiar with the different ways of spirituality people connect to God, and so I think for some of us we may be it may be sort of tiresome to think about different theological systems and things like that, but really what the theological systems are is they're historical stories about groups of people that have worked out common ways of relating to God, of connecting to God, and they've worked them out they work them out such that they work well enough that they get passed along from generation to generation in certain groups of people. And sort of just to understand that church history is and theology is a story of how people related to God, and because of those stories of how we learn to relate to God, it ends up giving us access to certain gifts, but maybe also some flat sides.
Yeah, and I think we should be clear that part of this grid is not meant to pigeonhole students or to say, oh, look at you, you're quite liturgical right now, or it's not meant to, but using these categories that actually help us understand the diversity of the students we work with, and it gives us language that kind of fleshes out all the unique ways that they've been shaped and influenced from their churches or their culture or their background.
Right. Thanks, Andy. That's really helpful, and that's a really helpful multi-ethnic analogy. Is that when we learn like Asian culture is this, the least helpful thing to do is when you're working with an Asian student is to say, oh well, since you're communal, you do this, right? That's not a helpful way is to use it to pigeonhole people. But what it is helpful to do is it helps us that as we ask questions to them and as we observe people's response and lack of response, like where are they resisting us as leaders, where are they responding to us as leaders, this helps us to reflect on that. And it can help us reflect on it, help us ask questions of ourselves or of them, so that it's not just blind of saying what are they resisting, it's what are they resisting, what are they responding to, but maybe this might help us in those kinds of internal processing, or if once we get to know them better in our questioning of asking them, can you tell me a little bit about your church background? Did you hear anything like this, like we're talking about? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah. And I guess for those of you who are watching live, or if you're watching this later, I think it would be really good. An application from our time together is to think about your own journey, and how has God shaped your view of reconciliation, and where have been the theological starting points, and the gifts of your church background, your denominational background, your cultural, ethnic, racial background, and how has that shaped how you started to really fall in love with this beautiful, full picture of reconciliation. And as you've journeyed in that topic, as you've grown in your faith, as you've explored the scriptures, where have been the journey, the steps you've taken, and which quadrants? And as you unpack that, where might be areas that are a little bit less underdeveloped? Like for me, I would say definitely the liturgical. And it's kind of interesting right now because I have found myself drawn. I have some friends who are very active in like Anglican churches and are really being drawn to the liturgy and the way that they do church. And so for me, I'm at this place where I think I'm intrigued, and there's something about it that feels like it's resonating with my spirit. And so for me, that's something that I'm exploring. So I guess when I heard, as Joe, you and I were preparing, it brought to my mind of like, okay, I had been checking it out, and there is something about that that has been opening me up in some new ways. And I want to be able to minister to students who are coming from this background. And I thought about all the Catholic students that came to our fellowship, that maybe I could have helped them on the journey better if I were more equipped to understand where they were coming from. So I don't know, Joe, as you've kind of journeyed with this personally, what's been your evolution through the quadrants? How would you describe your personal journey?
Sure. I think I came from a very conservative immigrant. You might call it a fundamentalist kind of background. I would use I would say fundamentalist in the best possible way. Like I felt like I had a very healthy fundamentalist church, and so it's not just a pejorative. And I think I came from that background. I think moving into a pretty significantly white world in North Carolina exposed me to the Reformed tradition. Significantly, it was very helpful for me. It helped me see that it wasn't all about just what I had to do, but what God had already done. That was very significant. Through InterVarsity, particularly coming on staff, I think I heard about social justice as a student in InterVarsity, and I didn't understand it very well. But there are some people in my chapter who thought about it, modeled it. I think that as I came on staff, understanding more about the social justice tradition was helpful for me, and it was a way for me to see, it's not just about me, but it's about God and others. It's about groups of people, not just individual, but it's groups. So the whole corporate, not just individual. There was a Urbana talk by several Urbana talks about this, and any number of Urbanas. That Peter Cha had one talk a number of Urbanas ago about the vertical and horizontal aspects of the gospel, and I think that was very significant for me. I think later in life, both me and my wife, we've had that similar sense of appreciating the liturgical, the historically rooted church traditions, and also taking some seminary, getting some seminary influence, and taking really just one class from Duke Divinity School, but a sort of influence from Stanley Hauerwas, and sort of the radical orthodoxy circle of theology. In some ways, very much like this box, it felt like it completed the circle. It felt like, this high view of the church, which actually I came from a pretty low view of the church theologically. The Chinese church is a very high view of the church, like practically speaking, but it's a lower view of the church theologically, theoretically, and I just felt like it totally tied it all together. It actually brought together this reforged view of what God had already done, what's a spiritual reality and already accomplished, and the social justice tradition of saying, it actually comes together in this view of what the church is, and my view, of what Paul is saying in all of his writings is that the church itself is God's symbol. Like when the church itself is the symbol on earth for what God is all about. That basically in place of communities that have cultural symbols, that for Paul the church was the cultural symbol. The community was the cultural symbol for the way he wanted the world to be. And so to me, I felt like that church part was the upper right quadrant about the liturgical tradition. That helps. To me, I felt like it was the last cog that made everything make sense.
Yeah, and so I guess as we kind of wrap things up, I think if to kind of bring things all together, I feel like we've heard, I think, a call for us personally as ministers who are committed to the message of reconciliation to be personally engaging in the full orb, the two grid, 3D, the fullness of the message of reconciliation that's both now and not yet, that's individual and corporate. And so as we personally journey through that and go around the circle, how can we grow as ministers and communicators and teachers and disciplers and leaders, as people who can meet students where they're at in their quadrant and have the biblical and practical skills to take them on the journey and the personal experiences to back it up with integrity. And I think as we do that, we're inviting more students from the diversity of traditions and perspectives to inform us and shape us, so that we can be a movement that actually speaks to the nuances and the beauty of the gospel. And some of this is because you and I both kind of come from the Asian American Reformed tradition. Even in our conversation, we've kind of hit on maybe one wedge of the pie. And I think the interesting thing that could happen in subsequent conversations is how can we flesh this out even fuller and invite more voices into this conversation. And if you're watching this on social media, like, reach out to us. We'd love to talk more with you about how you're interacting with this, and how you've experienced this, and how this might play out in your particular ministry theological context. And so, Joe, I guess, yeah, we just want to wrap things up, but is there anything that you just want to say and encourage? There's been about 20 to 25 folks who've been kind of in and out of our time. Anything that you just want to leave us with as we transition to end?
Nope, you did a great job, Andy. I think you wrapped it up well, so thanks so much.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Joe, for making time. And yeah, love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation on Twitter. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.